Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, Chapter 7, Part 1. At the time when I stood in the churchyard reading the family tombstones, I had just enough learning to be able to spell them out. My construction even of their simple meaning was not very correct, for I read "wife of the above" as a complimentary reference to my father's exaltation to a better world, and if any one of my deceased relations had been referred to as below, I have no doubt I should have formed the worst opinions of that member of the family. Neither were my notions of the theological positions to which my catechism bound me at all accurate, for I have a lively remembrance that I supposed my declaration that I was to walk in the same all the days of my life laid me under an obligation always to go through the village from our house in one particular direction, and never to vary it by turning down by the wheelwrights or up by the mill. When I was old enough, I was to be apprenticed to Joe, and until I could assume that dignity I was not to be what Mrs. Joe called pomp-eyed, or, as I render it, pampered. Therefore I was not only odd boy about the forge, but if any neighbor happened to want an extra boy to frighten birds or pick up stones or do any such job, I was favored with the employment. In order, however, that our superior position might not be compromised thereby, a money box was kept on the kitchen mantel shelf, into which it was publicly made known that all my earnings were dropped. I have an impression that they were to be contributed eventually toward the liquidation of the national debt, but I know I had no hope of any personal participation in the treasure. Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt kept an evening school in the village. That is to say, she was a ridiculous old woman of limited means and unlimited infirmity, who used to go to sleep from 6 to 7 every evening in the society of youth, who paid 2 pence per week each for the improving opportunity of seeing her do it. She rented a small cottage, and Mr. Wopsle had the room upstairs, where we students used to overhear him reading aloud in a most dignified and terrific manner, and occasionally bumping on the ceiling. There was a fiction that Mr. Wopsle examined the scholars once a quarter. What he did on those occasions was turn up his cuffs, stick up his hair, and give us Mark Antony's oration over the body of Caesar. This was always followed by Collins's Ode to the Passions, wherein I particularly venerated Mr. Wopsle as Revenge throwing his blood-stained sword in thunder down, and taking the war-denouncing trumpet with a withering look. It was not with me then, as it was in later life, when I fell into the society of the passions, and compared them with Collins and Wopsle, rather to the disadvantage of both gentlemen. Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt, besides keeping this educational institution, kept in the same room a little general shop. She had no idea what stock she had or what the price of anything in it was, but there was a little greasy memorandum book kept in a drawer, which served as a catalogue of prices, and by this oracle Biddy arranged all the shop transactions. Biddy was Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt's granddaughter. I confess myself quite unequal to the working out of the problem, what relation she was to Mr. Wopsle. She was an orphan like myself. Like me, too, she had been brought up by hand. She was most noticeable, I thought, in respect of her extremities, for her hair always wanted brushing, her hands always wanted washing, and her shoes always wanted mending and pulling up at the heel. This description must be received with a weekday limitation. On Sundays, she went to church elaborated. Much of my unassisted self, and more by the help of Biddy than of Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt, I struggled through the alphabet as if it had been a bramble bush, getting considerably worried and scratched by every letter. After that I fell among those thieves, the 9 figures, who seemed every evening to do something new to disguise themselves and baffle recognition. But at last I began, in a purblind, groping way, to read, write, and cipher, on the very smallest scale. One night I was sitting in the chimney corner with my slate, expending great efforts on the production of a letter to Joe. I think it must have been a full year after our hunt upon the marshes, for it was a long time after, and it was a winter and a hard frost. With an alphabet on the hearth at my feet for reference, I contrived in an hour or two to print and smear this epistle. My dear Joe, I hope you are quite well. I hope I shall soon be able to teach you, Joe, and then we sure'll be so glad, and when I am prenticed to you, Joe, what larks, and believe me, and Pip. There was no indispensable necessity for my communicating with Joe by letter, inasmuch as he sat beside me when we were alone. But I delivered this written communication, slate and all, with my own hand, and Joe received it as a miracle of erudition. "I say, Pip, old chap," cried Joe, opening his blue eyes wide, "what a scholar you are, ain't you?" "I should like to be," said I, glancing at the slate as he held it, with a misgiving that the writing was rather hilly. "Why, here's a J," said Joe, "and a O equal to anythink. Here's a J and a O, Pip, and a J-O, Joe." I had never heard Joe read aloud to any greater extent than this monosyllable, and I had observed at church last Sunday, when I accidentally held our prayer book upside down, that it seemed to suit his convenience quite as well as if it had been all right. Wishing to embrace the present occasion of finding out whether in teaching Joe I should have to begin quite at the beginning, I said, "Ah, but read the rest, Joe." "The rest, eh, Pip?" said Joe, looking at it with a slow, searching eye. "1, 2, 3. Why, here's 3 J's, and 3 O's, and 3 J-O Joes in it, Pip." I leaned over Joe, and with the aid of my forefinger, read him the whole letter. "Astonishing," said Joe, when I had finished. "You are a scholar." "How do you spell Gargery, Joe?" I asked him, with a modest patronage. "I don't spell it at all," said Joe. "But supposing you did?" "I can't be supposed," said Joe, "though I'm uncommon fond of reading too." "Are you, Joe?" "Uncommon. Give me," said Joe, "a good book or a good newspaper, and sit me down afore a good fire, and I ask no better. Lord," he continued, after rubbing his knees a little, "when you do come to a J and a O, and says you, here at last is a J-O Joe, how interesting reading is." I derived from this that Joe's education, like steam, was yet in its infancy. Pursuing the subject, I inquired, "Didn't you ever go to school, Joe, when you were as little as me?" "No, Pip." "Why didn't you ever go to school, Joe, when you were as little as me?" "Well, Pip," said Joe, taking up the poker and settling himself to his usual occupation when he was thoughtful, of slowly raking the fire between the lower bars, "I'll tell you. My father, Pip, he were given to drink, and when he were overtook with drink, he hammered away at my mother, most unmerciful. It was the only hammering he did, indeed, excepting at myself, and he hammered at me with a vigor only to be equaled by the vigor with which he didn't hammer at his anvil. You are listening and understanding, Pip?" "Yes, Joe." "Consequence, my mother and me, we ran away from my father several times, and then my mother, she'd go out to work, and she'd say, 'Joe,' she'd say, 'now please God, you shall have some schooling, child,' and she'd put me to school. But my father were that good in his heart that he couldn't abear to be without us. So he'd come with a most tremendous crowd, and make such a row at the doors of the houses where we was, that they used to be obligated to have no more to do with us and to give us up to him. And then he took us home and hammered us, which, you see, Pip," said Joe, pausing in his meditative raking of the fire and looking at me, "were a drawback on my learning." "Certainly, poor Joe." "Though mind you, Pip," said Joe, with a judicial touch or two of the poker on the top bar, "rendering unto all their due, and maintaining equal justice betwixt man and man, my father were that good in his heart, don't you see?" I didn't see, but I didn't say so. "Well," Joe pursued, "somebody must keep the pot a-bilin', Pip, or the pot won't bile, don't you know?" I saw that, and said so. "Consequence, my father didn't make objections to my going to work, so I went to work at my present calling, which were his too, if he would have followed it, and I worked tolerable hard, I assure you, Pip. In time I were able to keep him, and I kept him till he went off in the purple leptic fit, and it were my intentions to have and put upon his tombstone that, what summers the failings on his part, remember, reader, he were that good in his heart." Joe recited this couplet with such manifest pride and careful perspicuity that I asked him if he had made it himself. "I made it," said Joe, "my own self. I made it in a moment. It was like striking out a horseshoe complete in a single blow. I never was so much surprised in all my life. Couldn't credit my own Ed To tell you the truth, hardly believed it were my own Ed. As I was saying, Pip, it were my intentions to have had it cut over him, but poetry costs money. Cut it how you will, large or small, and it were not done. Not to mention bearers, all the money that could be spared were wanted for my mother. She were in poor health and quite broke. She weren't long of following, poor soul, and her share of peace come around at last.